Alright, guys, so we are on Book 2, The Living, Chapter 11 of Johnny Got His Gun. So 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 16 is 256. 256 times 256 is, oh well, that was far enough anyhow. Alright then, 2 times 3 is 6. 6 times 6 is 36. 36 times 36 is 526. 500 in hell, that wasn't any good. That was as far as he could go. That was the trouble with numbers. They got so big you couldn't handle them, and even if you could, they got you nowhere. Try something else. Lie and lay. Now I lay me down to sleep. I lay these flowers on the table. I lie them on the table. I lie down to sleep. He laid there for 3 hours. I lie this book down. What the hell? Why not put it down and be done with it? Who is there? Whom is there? Of whom to who, of who to whom? Between you and I and the gatepost, between you and me, between us, that's much better. There's nobody like her, nobody like she. There's nobody like she is. There's nobody like her is, nobody like her. David Copperfield had a tough time and was apprenticed to Mr. Micawber, who believed everything would turn out well. There was an Aunt Dorothy or something like that. David ran away to her. His mother had big brown eyes and was gentle, and Barkis was willing. The father was dead. Old Scrooge was tight, and Tiny Tim said, "God bless us all." There was a pudding round like a cannonball with fire. Tiny Tim was a cripple. The last of the Mohicans was an Iroquois. Was he or wasn't he? And where did Leather Stocking come in? Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Noble 600. There's not to reason why, there's but to do or die, nothing more. When the frost is on the pumpkin and the fodder's in the shock, when you hear the ta-de-dum-dee of the ta-da, turkey cock, no good, maybe something else. There are 8 planets. There are Earth, Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3 more. He didn't know. A star flickers and a planet has steady light. He couldn't remember. Thou shalt not have any other gods before me. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt honor thy father and mother. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's ox, nor his ass, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Not enough. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor, for they shall see God. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness' sake, for they shall do something or other he couldn't remember. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me beside the green pastures. He leadeth me beside the cool waters. He anointeth my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I shall fear no evil, for thy rod and thy buckler, they comfort me. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That was pretty good. That was the best yet. Hell, the trouble with him was he didn't know anything. He didn't know a thing. Why hadn't they taught him something he could remember? Why didn't he have something to think about? Here he was with nothing to do but think, and he didn't have anything to fall back on. All he could remember was himself, his life, and that was bad. His mind was the only thing he had left, and he had to find something to use it for. Only he couldn't use it because he didn't know anything. He was ignorant as a baby when he really tried to think. If he could remember a book chapter for chapter, he could lie back and read it over and over again in his mind. Only he couldn't remember. He couldn't even remember the plots, much less the chapters. Only a little bit here and a little bit there. It wasn't that he had forgotten how to remember, it was just that he never paid any attention, so he had nothing worth remembering. He was a man, he was alive, he would be alive for a long time, and he had to have something to do, to think about. He had to start in like a baby and learn. He had to concentrate. He had to start in at the beginning. He had to start in with an idea. The idea had been seeping into his mind for a long while, just how long he didn't know, and the idea was this, that the important thing is time. He remembered from ancient history in the 10th grade that was way back, even before Christ, the first men who began to think were thinking of time. They studied the stars and figured out the week and the month and the year so that there would be some way of measuring time. That was smart of them because he was about in the same fix they were, and he knew that time was the most important thing in the world. It was the only real thing. It was everything. If you can keep track of time, you can get a hold on yourself and keep yourself in the world, but if you lose it, why, then you are lost too. The last thing that ties in with other people was gone and you were all alone. He remembered how the Count of Monte Cristo, when he was put into his dungeon down there in the darkness, kept a record of time. He remembered how Robinson Crusoe was very careful to keep track of time even though he never had any appointments. No matter how far you are separated from other people, if you have an idea of time, why then you are in the same world with them, you are part of them, but if you lose time, the others go on ahead of you and you are left alone, hanging in air, lost to everything forever. All he knew was that on a day in September in 1918, time stopped. There was a howl somewhere and he dived into a dugout and things blotted out and he lost time. From that instant to the present, he might as well figure that there was a chunk of time he could never regain. Even if he discovered a way to check up on time from now on, that which was gone was lost forever, and he would always be living behind the rest of the world because of it. He could remember nothing after the explosion until he woke up and realized he was deaf. His wounds were very serious, and he might have been unconscious for 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months before he awakened, who could tell? And then afterwards, the faintings in and out, and the long periods when he simply lay in between thinking and dreaming and imagining things. When you're completely unconscious, there is no such thing as time. It goes like the snap of your finger. You're awake and zip, you're awake again with no idea of how long a time passed between. Then when you're fainting in and out, time must still seem shorter than to a normal person because you're really half crazy and half awake and time bunches up on you. They said his mother was in labor 3 days when she had him, and yet when it was all over she figured she had been in labor for about 10 hours. Even with pain and everything, time had seemed shorter to her than it really was. Now if all this was true, he probably had lost more time than he expected. He might even have lost a year, 2 years. The idea gave him a funny prickling feeling. It was a kind of fear, yet not like any ordinary fear. It was more of a panic. It was the panicky dread of losing yourself, even from yourself. It made him a little sick at his stomach. The whole idea had been taking form in his head for a long while, the idea of trapping time and getting himself back into the world, but he hadn't been able to concentrate on it. He had drifted off into dreams, or he had found himself suddenly in the middle of thinking of something entirely different. Once he thought he had the problem solved by the visits of the nurse. He didn't know how many times she came into his room every 24 hours, but she must have a schedule. All he had to do was to count the seconds, then the minutes, then the hours between each visit she made until he had 24 hours counted, and after that he would be able to figure the days simply by counting her visits. There would be no danger of a slip-up because the vibration of her footsteps always awakened him. Then just in case the spacing of her visits might be changed sometime, he could figure out things like the number of his bowel movements each day, and he could also figure out the other things which happened maybe only 2 or 3 or 4 times a week, like his baths and the changing of his bedcloths and mask. Then if any of these things changed, he could check up on it by the others. It took a long time to make his mind stick on the idea, long enough to figure out this formula, excuse me, because he wasn't used to thinking, but in the end he thought it through. He thought it through and started putting it into effect. The instant the nurse left him, he began to count. He counted to 60, which meant a minute, as nearly as he would ever be able to figure it. Then in one side of his mind he checked up the minute he had measured and began counting from 1 to 60 again. The first time he tried it, he got up to 11 minutes before his mind slipped off the track and his figures were lost. It happened like this. He was counting along on the seconds when all of a sudden he thought, maybe you're counting too fast, and then he thought, remember, it seems to take a sprinter an awful long time to run 100 yards, yet he does it in only 10 seconds. Then he slowed down his counting while he watched an imaginary sprinter step off 100 yards, and then he was in the middle of a high school track meet, Shell City against Montrose, watching Ted Smith run the 100-yard dash and win it with his head high, lunging for the tape, and all the kids from Shell City yelling their heads off. And then he had lost count. That meant he had to wait all over again for the nurse because she was his starting point. It seemed like hundreds, maybe thousands of times that he got started out and then lost track and had to sink back angrily into the darkness of his mind and wait for the vibration of her feet and the feel of her hands on him again so he could start anew. Once he got up to 114 minutes and thought, I wonder how long 114 minutes is in hours, and stopped in spite of himself to figure it out and discovered it was an hour and 54 minutes. And then he remembered a phrase, 54, 40, or fight. And he remembered a phrase, 54, 40, or fight, and almost went crazy trying to recall where it came from and what it meant. He couldn't remember, and when he got back to the counting, he realized that he had lost a lot of minutes in thinking, and so even though he had broken a record, he was no farther along than when the idea of time first entered his mind. On that day, he realized he was tackling the thing from the wrong angle, because to figure it out, he would have to stay awake for 24 hours in a stretch, counting steadily all the time without making a mistake. In the first place, it was almost impossible for a normal person to stay awake counting that long, much less a guy whose body was two-thirds asleep to begin with. And in the second place, he couldn't help making a mistake because he couldn't keep the minute figures separate in his mind from the second figures. He would be counting along on the seconds when all of a sudden he would get panicky and think about how many minutes was it. He would be counting along on the seconds when all of a sudden he would get panicky and think, how many minutes was it I had? And even though he was almost positive it was 22 or 37 or whatever it was, the tinge of doubt that had first caused him to ask the question hung on, and then he was sure he was wrong, and by that time he had lost count again. He never succeeded in counting the time from one visit to the next, but he began to realize that even if he did, he would then have to keep 3 sets of figures: the seconds, the minutes, and the count of the nurse's visits until 24 hours were completed. Then he would have to stop some time to reduce the minutes to hours, because when the minute figures got too high, he wouldn't be able to remember them at all. So with the hours, he would have a fourth set of figures, and counting just the seconds and minutes, which was as far as he ever got. He tried to pretend that they were actual figures that he could see on a blackboard. He pretended he was in a room with a blackboard on the right side and another on the left. He would keep the minutes on the left-hand blackboard, and then they would be there when he needed to add another to them. But it didn't work. He couldn't remember. Each time he failed, he could feel choking gasps in his chest and stomach, and he knew that he was crying. He decided to forget all about the counting and to check up on simpler things. It didn't take long to discover that he had a bowel movement about once in every 3 visits from the nurse, although sometimes it took 4 visits. But that didn't tell him anything. He remembered that doctors used to say twice a day was healthy, but the people's doctors were talking about, He remembered that doctors used to say twice a day was healthy, but the people doctors were talking about had a no. He remembered that doctors used to say twice a day was healthy, meaning using the restroom, but the people doctors were talking about had normal food and they ate it with their mouths and swallowed it with their throats. The stuff he was fed might give him a much higher average than ordinary people. Then again, just lying in his bed from one year to the next, he might need much food, and so his score might be much less than ordinary people. He also discovered that his bath and change of bedclothes came about once in every 12 visits. It was 13 once, and another time only 10, so we couldn't count on it absolutely, but it was at least a figure. He was a little surprised to discover that where he had first thought of seconds and minutes, he was now thinking of days and even series of days. That was how he got on the right track. It came to him while he was lying and feeling with the skin of his neck the line that the covers made at his throat. He got to imagining them a mountain range snugging down against his throat. He had 1 or 2 strangling dreams from them, but he kept on thinking. He got to thinking that the only part of him that wasn't covered up, that was free, that was just as it should be, was the skin on the sides of his neck, which went from the cover line to his ears and the half of his forehead above the mask. That skin and his hair. He said to himself, maybe there is some way you could use those patches of skin. They are free to the air, and they are healthy, and a guy with a few healthy things as you've got should put them to use. So he got to thinking of what a man did with skin, and he realized that it was used to fill with. But that didn't seem enough. He thought about skin some more, and then he remembered that you could also sweat with it, and that when you started sweating you were hot, but by the time the sweat covered your skin you were cool from the air drying the sweat. That was how he got the idea of heat and cold, and that was how he came to wait for the sunrise. The whole thing was so simple that his stomach grew hard with excitement just from thinking about it. All he had to do was to feel with his skin. When the temperature changed from cool to warm, he would know it was sunrise in the beginning of a day. Then he would check right through counting the nurse's visits to the next sunrise, and then he would have the number of her visits per day, and he would forever afterward be able to tell time. He started trying to stay awake until the change in temperature occurred, but half a dozen times running, he fell asleep before it happened. Other times he got confused, thinking to himself, is it hot now or is it cool? What kind of a change am I waiting for? Maybe I am running a fever. Maybe I am too excited and am sweating from excitement, and that would spoil the whole thing. Oh, please, God, don't let me sweat. Don't let me run a temperature. Let me know whether I'm hot let me know whether I'm hot now or whether I'm cold. Give me some idea of when the sunrise is coming, and then I'll be able to catch it. And then after a long, long while, with a lot of false starts, he said to himself, here, sit down and think this thing over seriously. Right now you're panicky, you're too anxious, and you're blundering. Each time you make a mistake, you've lost more time, and that is one thing you can't afford to lose. Think what usually happens in the morning in the hospital and try to figure out what follows that. That's easy, he said to himself. In the mornings in a hospital, nurses try to get their heavy work done. That meant that he was bathed and his bedclothes were probably changed in the morning. He would have to take that as at his starting point. He would have to take that as his starting point. He would have to assume a few things, and the first assumption would be that this was true. He already knew that the bath and the change of bedding came on an average of once in every 12 visits. Okay, so he can't even hear, and he's blind. He wouldn't even know what day it is. Now we had to begin assuming again. You would think in a hospital like this that your bedding would be changed at least every other day. Maybe it was once a day, but he didn't think so, because at the rate of one change in every 12 visits, that would make the nurse visit him every 2 hours, and there was so little to do, he couldn't see why her trips should be that often. So he would figure that every 2 days she bathed him and changed his bedclothes, and that she did this in the morning. If this was true, then she came into his room 6 times in a day and night. That would make it every 4 hours. The simplest schedule for her to follow would be to come in at 8, 12, 4, 8, 12, 4, and so on. She would probably change the bedding as early as possible in the morning, so that would be at 8 o'clock. Now he said to himself, what is it you want to try to check up on, the sunrise first or the sunset? He decided it was a sunrise because when the sun sets, the warmth of the day usually hangs on, and the change is so slow that those two pieces of skin on his neck might not be able to catch it. But in the early dawn, everything is cool, and almost the first flash of sunlight should give some kind of heat. At least the change should be more complete in the morning than at night, so he would catch the sunrise. He had a panicky minute when he thought, what if you are on the west side of the hospital and the setting sun comes in full on the bed, and then you'll mistake that for sunrise? What if you're on the north or south side of the hospital and never get the direct sunlight at all? Maybe that would be simpler. Then he realized that even if he were on the west side and caught the heat of the setting sun, he would still have the visits of the nurse to check on to tell him which was which, because by now he was convinced she changed the bedclothes in the morning. Now you damn fool, he said to himself, you're getting things so complicated you'll never come out if you don't stop. The first thing to do is to catch the sunrise. Next time the nurse comes into the room and bathes you and changes the bedclothes, you are going to assume it is 8 o'clock in the morning. Then you can think about anything you want to without worrying, or you can even go to sleep, because each time she comes in, she awakens you. You will wait and count 5 more visits, and that should make the 5th one somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning. 4 o'clock in the morning is just before sunrise, so after the 5th visit from the nurse, you will stay awake and concentrate every bit of your mind and skin on the job of catching the temperature change when it comes. Maybe it'll work and maybe it won't. If it does, all you have to do is to wait 6 more trips and see if there was another sunrise, and if there is, you'll have the number of trips every 24 hours, and that will give you a way of setting up a calendar around the nurse's visits. The important thing is to catch 2 sunrises in a row, and then you have trapped time forever. Then you can begin to catch up with the world. It was 8 visits later before he felt the nurse's hands on him as she took off his nightshirt and began to sponge his stump with warm water. She began to sponge his stump with warm water. He felt his heart quicken and his blood sent a warm glow of excitement to his skin, because he was going to start out once more to trap time, only now he was doing it smartly, he was doing it wisely. He found himself rolled over on his side and held there while the bed quivered from the nurse's work. Then he was rolled back between crisp, cool sheets. The nurse thumped around at the foot of the bed for a minute. He felt the vibrations of her footsteps as she walked from place to place in the room. Then the vibrations receded and there was a sharp little tremor of the door closing and he knew he was alone. Calm down, he said to himself. Calm down because you haven't proved anything yet. You may have this thing doped out all wrong. Maybe the things you've assumed are all wrong. If they are, then you've got to make a whole new set of assumptions, so don't get so cocky. Just calm down and lie back and count 5 more visits. He dozed a little and he thought of a lot of things, but always on the blackboard in his mind. He kept the number 2 or 3 or whatever it was, and finally the 5th visit came with the nurse's feet vibrating against the floor and her hands on him and on the bed. According to the things he had figured out, it should now be 4 o'clock in the morning, and in a little while, depending on whether it was winter or summer or fall or spring, the sun would rise. When she left, he began concentrating. He didn't dare fall asleep. He didn't dare permit his mind to wander for 1 minute. He didn't dare let the suffocating excitement that was all over him he didn't dare let the suffocating excitement that was all over him and inside of him interfere with his thinking and feeling as he lay there waiting for the sunrise. He had come on the trail of something so precious and so exciting that it was almost like being born all over again into the world. He lay there and thought, in 1 hour, 3 hours, certainly in 10 hours, I will feel the change on my skin, and then I will know whether it is day or night. It seemed that time was standing perfectly still just to spite him. He got panicky little spasms when he felt sure the change had occurred without him catching it, and with each little spasm he seemed to get sick at his stomach. Then there would be a clear period when he would very calmly feel with his skin and convince himself that he was sane, that he hadn't fallen asleep and missed it, that his mind hadn't wandered, that the change was still ahead. And then all of a sudden he realized it was coming. The muscles in his back and thighs and stomach stiffened because he knew it was coming. He could almost feel the sweat squeeze out of his body as he tried to hold his breath lest he miss it. The pieces of skin on each side of his neck and the half of his forehead seemed to tingle as if they had been paralyzed and now were getting a fresh supply of blood. It felt as if the pores of his neck were actually reaching out to grab at the change, to suck it in. The whole thing was so slow, so gradual, that it seemed impossible it was happening at all. There was no danger now of his mind wandering or of falling asleep. It would be like falling asleep in the middle of a first kiss. It would be like falling asleep in the middle of running a 100-yard dash and winning it. The only thing he could do was wait and fill out with his skin and catch every second of the change, every slow movement of time and the temperature as they offered him a return to life. It seemed like he lay there stiff and expectant and excited for hours. There were times when he was sure that the nerves of his neck were not registering, when it seemed they had suddenly gone numb and that the change might slip away from him. And then there were other times when it felt as if his nerves had jabbed through so near the surface of his skin that there was actual pain, sharp and fine and penetrating, as they groped to register the change. And then the thing began to happen swiftly and more swiftly, and although he knew he was in a sheltered hospital room as far removed as possible from changes in temperature, it seemed to him when it came that it came in a blaze of heat. It felt like his neck was seared, burned, scorched from the heat of the rising sun. It had penetrated his room. He had recaptured time. He had won his fight. The muscles of his body relaxed, in his mind, in his heart, and whatever parts of him that were left, he was singing, singing, singing. It was dawn. All over the world, or at least all over the country to which he had been brought, the sun was rising in the east, and people were getting out of bed, and the hills were turning pink, and birds were singing. All over Europe or all over America, it was sun up. What the hell did it matter if you didn't have any nose, so long as you could smell the dawn? He lay without nostrils, and he sniffed. He caught the smell of dew on grass, and he shivered because it was so delicious. He shaded his eyes against the first bright rays of the morning sun and looked off, and he saw the high mountains of Colorado in the east, and he saw the sun coming over them, and he saw colors creeping down their sides, and in the nearer distance he saw rolling brown hills which became pink and lavender like the inside of a seashell. And still closer in the field in which he stood and clear up to his ankles, he saw the green grass, and it was sparkling, and he burst into tears. He thanked God that he could see the dawn. He turned from the sunrise and looked toward the little town in which he lived, toward the little town in which he had been born. All of the rooftops were rosy with the dawn. Even the houses that were unpainted and square and squat and ugly were beautiful. He heard the lowing of cows waiting to be milked in backyards, for the town in which he had been born was a very sensible town, and each man had his cow. He heard the slam of back screen doors as sleepy householders went to the chicken yard, or to the barnyard to take care of their animals, and he could see inside the houses where men were getting out of bed and yawning healthily and scratching their chests and groping for house slippers, and finally getting up and going into the kitchen where their wives had sausages and hotcakes and coffee for them. He saw babies squirming in their cribs and rubbing their eyes with tiny fists, and maybe smiling, or maybe crying, and maybe smelling a little bad, but looking awfully healthy as they greeted the sunshine, as they greeted the morning, as they greeted the dawn. He saw all of these things, all of these beautiful homely things, as he looked toward the town, and he had only to turn from the town to look at the sun and the mountains. Oh God, God, thank God, he thought. I've got it now, and they can't take it away from me. He thought, I have seen the dawn again, and I will see it every morning from now on. He thought, thank you, God, thank you, thank you. He thought, if I never have anything else, I will always have dawn and morning sunlight. Damn. I love this book, man. Peace, yo.